Welcome everyone today. My name is Trevor Bernard. I'm the director of the Wilberforce Institute, and I'm delighted to welcome you on this beautiful day in Hull to this online Wilberforce Institute public lecture program. It's our great pleasure today to introduce to you Dr. Blessing Chapfika, who is a recent graduate about to get his graduation very soon, who has graduated from the University of Hull in the School of Politics and International Studies. He has been at Hull for some time, but has also previously worked in Zimbabwe and also at the Oud Milan Academy of Science and Technology in Cape Town in South Africa. His topic today, which is African Notions of Freedom, is a very intriguing one. His research is on the philosophy of education in sub-Saharan Africa, especially Zimbabwe, and proposes a relevant African philosophy of education. He looks in particular at the intersection of the African philosophy question and the African colonial predicament. So it's a great pleasure, Blessing, to welcome you here to the Wilberforce Institute and to talk to us on African notions of freedom. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Thank you so much for the introduction. I am quite excited to be presenting today. Before I start, I just thought I need to reflect a little bit about today in history. Today, the 16th of June, in South Africa, is Youth Day. And this is actually a commemoration of the 1976 16th of June massacre of the school children who were protesting against the unilateral introduction of Afrikaans as a compulsory subject in high school. And that tragic incident also speaks to the deprivation of freedom to the young people in Africa during the colonial times. I am going to speak today on the African notions of freedom, a philosophical appraisal. Before I also start, I might also need to do a little bit of geographical delimitation, if I can put it that way. Africa is a vast continent. It actually has got 54 countries, and it is not homogeneous. And because it is not homogeneous, it is very difficult to speak about Africa in single terms. So at the moment, I am going to focus my Africa to Africa south of the Sahara. So when I speak about Africa, I am talking about Africa south of the Sahara. These are the countries in the south that tend to share quite a lot in terms of their language and in terms of their beliefs, values, and so on. Having said that, the meaning and application of the concept of freedom, a socioeconomic and moral value, remains a contentious issue among academics and politicians across the world. Since it is an inalienable right and transcendental quality of every human being, freedom finds its roots in the concept of self and personhood. It is a view that I am actually going to pursue in this presentation. In this presentation, I'll perform 5 tasks. The first, I will reiterate the difference between African and Western metaphysics regarding the self, and consequently the difference in the conception of freedom. Second, I assess the impact of slavery and colonization on the African conception of the self and freedom. Third, I will analyze scholarly views about the African post-colonial predicament and the cause for decolonization. Fourth, I critique some African scholars' tendency of testing African notions of freedom against the Western concept of freedom. Fifth, I would propose an indaba for African academics to consider some practical solutions to tackle the apparent economic stagnation and general decline in African developmental potential, which is in the main the source of disillusionment and anxiety among Africans on the African continent and in the diaspora. I will start by exploring the conventional definitions of the concept of freedom, in which, in my view, largely represent the Western conception of the concept. The approach of starting with the conventional views serves a dual purpose. First, to appreciate how Western notions of freedom compare with African ones. Second, to understand the influence of the Western notions of freedom on the African worldview. Of particular interest is the impact of Western notions of freedom on the African thinking about African thinking. The New International Webster's Comprehensive Dictionary of the English Language defines freedom as the exemption or liberation from slavery or imprisonment, and specifies the exemption from political restraint and autocratic control. This definition presents freedom in a negative sense, that is the absence of political limitation and control. The definition I lost my track there. The definition ties well with the thinking of John Stuart Mill and John Locke. In his essay on liberty, Mill stresses that a person should be free to do as he likes in his own conscience, but ought not to be free to do as he likes in acting for another under the pretext that the affairs of the other is his own affairs. In his work, an essay concerning human understanding, Locke considers liberty as, open quote, the power to act and not to act according to the direction of the mind. Last God. Mill and Locke emphasize the role of obstructed desire and will, respectively, in directing the individual actions. For Locke, the willpower is responsible for directing the operative faculties to motion and to rest in particular instances. The main thrust of both J.S. Mill and John Locke on liberty is to monitor and limit the interference of government or authority in general on the affairs of the individual. This understanding of freedom presents some theoretical and practical issues. Clearly, this portrays a utopian concept of freedom where the person has freedom to do as they please, and it actually promotes resentment against the control or interference of the state or the government on individual affairs. In his article From Freedom to Liberty, the Construction of a Political Value, Bernard Williams launches a comprehensive critique of such a concept of freedom, in which he terms primitive freedom. Williams, 2001, describes primitive freedom as the idea of being unobstructed in doing what you want by some form of humanly imposed coercion. The obstructive human activities include someone's omission or failure to remove the obstacle to the other agent's capacity. Although he emphasizes the limitation and futility of the attempt on definition, Williams considers the freedom as a political value because most important disagreements that surround freedom are political disagreements. For Williams, the primitive freedom views freedom from a human capacity to act, and therefore believes that we are unfree if our inability to do what we desire is the product of coercion, that is, the intentional obstructive activities of other people. In view of these obstructive activities, through both actions and omissions, primitive freedom becomes a ratio concept. That is, it is a matter of the ratio between what people desire to do and what they are prevented to do from doing by others. Williams rightly points out that primitive freedom concentrates too much on human sources of constraint and consequently promotes resentments towards state control. Primitive freedom, Williams argues, presents a ratio paradox by confusing lack of desire for freedom with freedom as in his imaginary case of a body of contented slaves. In his imaginary view about the body of contented slaves, Williams actually says imagined slaves that are quite contented, that they do not desire to do what they are prevented to do, and they are not ill-treated by the masters because they do not misbehave. And in that case, he actually said, if a reformer comes, because in that case, if we follow primitive freedom, if a reformer comes and conscientizes the contented slaves about what they are missing, and they become conscious of their lack of freedom, and they become unsettled, from the perspective of primitive freedom, we can actually say the reformer is the one who took away the slaves' freedom. Primitive freedom, in this case, it actually confuses, the lack of desire and freedom and having freedom. So a reformer who conscientizes the community of what they are missing and urge them to advocate for their freedom is blamed for taking away the freedom, when in fact the lack of freedom results from sustained coercion. Williams advocates for liberty within the political order that is protected by the state. Williams follows the thinking of Charles de Montesquieu, who shows that liberty consists in acting within the confines of the law. About liberty, he writes, the political freedom does not consist in doing whatever you want. Within a state, in a society where there are laws, the freedom consists only in doing what you have to want, and to be constrained to do, and not to be constrained to do what you should not want. The freedom is the right to do what the law permits. And if a citizen could do what the law forbid, he wouldn't be free anymore because the others would actually do the same. Williams argues that the existence of the state is not itself an offense against the limitations of liberty, though some particular forms of the state may, of course, do so. And that the amount of freedom that a person would have without the state is entirely indeterminate and at any rate, very small. In a state of anarchy, for instance, where there is no control of individual desire or will, there is no guarantee for liberty. In a political order, people understand and accept as rightful some restrictions to their liberty in the interest of other values such as equality. Williams described this acceptable cost in liberty which is outweighed by the value that the action produces. From the foregoing, we note that there is no agreement on the meaning and application of freedom. Some people advocate a form of primitive freedom and they pursue an unobstructed fulfillment of their desires and will, while others advocate freedom as a political value and accept lawful obstruction of desire or will for the sake of other values. Some people see the state as protecting and advancing their liberty, while others see the actions as obstructions of their freedom. There is disagreement even among those who believe in liberty as a political value on the extent and manner in which the state limit individual freedom. The common feature, however, is that all freedom concerned is about individual freedom. So this section, I actually have looked at the general understanding of freedom. And as I indicated earlier on, this would give us a little bit of an indication about freedom in the Western sense, or in the universal sense, or in the conventional sense, if I can put it that way. I am now going to look at freedom in the pre-colonial Africa. I start by stating the obvious, that a people's worldview informs their beliefs, knowledge, and values. As such, the African worldview informs the African concept of freedom. To understand the African view of freedom, one must inquire about the African metaphysics, particularly the African ontology in the pre-colonial times, which represent an adulterated view of the African concepts. By metaphysics, we mean that which comes after physics, the latter being the study of nature in general. That's the questions of metaphysics arises out, but go beyond factual and scientific questions about the world. A central part of metaphysics is ontology. This studies the being, and in particular nowadays, we talk about material objects, minds, persons, universals, numbers, and facts. Freedom, equality, and justice are essential and transcendental qualities of every human being. To understand the African view of freedom, we must attempt to grasp the African metaphysics. For instance, Magobe Ramosi describes freedom from an ontological perspective. For Ramosi, freedom is coeval with human existence. Freedom was a lived human experience long before wise words were spoken about it or erudite treatises written on it. Freedom was known wherever human beings lived. Freedom is not, in the first place, a hollow abstract concept subsisting in the metaphysical world of Platonic ideas. If it were such a concept, then it would have been separated from a human being, waiting to be seized and grasped by whoever cares to travel the metaphysical world of Plato's ideas. For us, meaning African people, freedom is rooted in the ontology of an embodied human being. It is concrete lived reality of the human being in the complex web relationship that stay alive in the unfolding, incessantly changing conditions of life. Class card. Ramos does not pursue a definition of freedom, but an understanding of the genesis of freedom. However, his view of freedom is subsisting in the human ontology is a truism with a remote possibility of attracting any objection. As an inherent transcendental quality of every human being, freedom is part of the human being. Therefore, as old as humanity, What is critical in Ramos' view of freedom is the emphasis on an embodied human being, the concrete reality, and a complex web relationships. African metaphysics follows a form of physicalism or materialism. In fact, African metaphysics is concerned about corporeal existence. It is in this context that we should understand Ramos' objection to the abstract concepts associated with Platonic idealism. African ontology focuses on corporeal being or existence. By corporeal existence, we mean tangible, physical, occupying space as opposed to some bundled up, imagined, or intangible existence. We mean a person as a body, a quality that she shares with a stone or other physical matter. A person as a man, a quality that she shares with a snake and other sentient beings. She also assumes the quality of a body. And a person as a human being, a quality of capable of reason and moral deliberation, forming relationships, building and evaluating institutions, and institutions that support her corporeality. She assumes the qualities of both a body and a man. The metaphysics of corporeality rejects or at least excludes the existence of some intangible structures such as Plato's forms, Gottfried Leibniz monads, and any such beings. More so, the celebrated inquiry by the rationalist metaphysicians into the being of such beings is also rejected. Although the African world is believed to be full of spiritual beings, the African ontology conceives such beings and other relationships they have with real people as physical. The ancestral spirits, for instance, are known through their human intermediaries, through whom they interact with the living. In the Shona culture, the intermediary is known as home or pocket. When the ancestral spirit is summoned, they come and possess the intermediary and then interact with the family. The living elders are even able to ascertain the departed elder's voice, mannerisms, and knowledge of the family. On the materialism that characterizes African thought, Ducaux has this to say, open quote, but among the traditional Africans, their spiritualist and idealist belief in God and gods or ancestors is limited by the pragmatic and materialist orientation in life. While the gods, spirits, ancestors are asked to come to eat and drink and to continue to protect against diseases and misfortunes, often these gods or ancestors are admonished when they fail to live up to their expectations. So human beings are at liberty to tell their ancestors off when things are not actually going according to plans. The physicalism or materialism of the African thought informs an African naturalism, a belief in the connectedness in nature or being. According to Ducaux, this materialist doctrine is a humanist and egalitarian because it argues that the unit and fundamental identity of nature suggests the unity and fundamental identity of man in society. The connectedness of nature or being is the foundation of African holisticism and the African values of integrity, harmony, cooperation, and community. It is in the same context that Godfrey Ozumba propounds his idea of the missing link in his integrative humanism. Uzumba's concept of the missing link maintains that everything is an important link to the completion of nature or to the completion of being. We therefore understand them. We therefore understand human freedom in traditional Africa within the framework of the connectedness of being. So for the Africans, Decaux argues, God, self-consciousness, existentialism, and materialism could collectively or individually be the basis of African freedom. In other words, human freedom in traditional Africa is twofold. First, the freedom that a person attains by understanding the unit in nature. And by nature, we mean human beings, the natural world, and the spiritual world. In other words, freedom through self-knowledge. This is freedom through self-knowledge. Second, the freedom that a person attains by working to protect or promote the unity in nature. In other words, freedom through actions. In traditional Africa, being is being together. In other words, we are actually saying you are your brother's keeper. J.S. Mbiti, in an African spin-off from René Descartes' Cartesianism, summarizes this by an epistemic dictum which says, I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. In this context, Decaux has this to say: the African conception of freedom can be traced to the realm of ideas bordering the African communalist ideology, and often her conception of the personal God. African man is understood and explained in terms of the integration in the network of relationship in the society among individuals and their relationship to the past, present, and future generations. To use the terms familiar to those who advocate for primitive freedom, the desire or will of the traditional African is to protect and advance the fullness of being, or the unity in nature. Due to the unity in nature, the self and the other, or the community, are intricately connected, such that what affects the one affects the other. For Rook, existence means standing in a particular relationship with all there is, both invisible and visible. And for Okolo, 1993, individuals only become real in their relationship with others, in a community or in a group. Understandably so, this could be quite confusing to an observer, especially one who is accustomed to an individualistic or atomistic worldview. In the African worldview, it is ontologically impossible to drive a wedge between the individual and the other or his community without diminishing his value. It is important, however, to consider some of the critiques against the African worldview and the traditional African concept of freedom. I will consider a few cases. Goodwin Okaneme argues that the well-being and prosperity of the community is the utmost important to the individual. In the African context, the individual subjugate his comfort and well-being to the comfort of the community. So there is an element of subjugation of the individual. Sibinze shares his sentiments. Although an individual is swallowed by the society in African communalism, he still enjoys his freedom. So again, we also see the swallowing of the individual. Stephen Chukwujeku and Peter Iloyanya have this to say: African metaphysics of reality and worldview almost sacrifices the freedom and autonomy of the self and the individual at the altar of the community. So there is also the individual being treated as a sacrificial lamb at the altar of the community. There is this view from Barnabas Okolo, which is quite lengthy, but I think it's quite important, so I will actually read it out. Okolo at this point, he is actually reacting to Nze's confirmation that there is indeed a bit of freedom in in African understanding. So Okolo is saying the Nze's view is highly defective at best or incomplete. This is because at the bottom, the seemingly freedom which the individual enjoys is ultimately and in reality a derivative one dependent on the largely determined by the other. That is the community. Little or no room is left for the individual for initiative, responsibility, auto-decision, auto-determination, etc., which individuals cherish as individuals and which are the hallmarks of true liberty and autonomy. However, a man intrinsic and not intrinsic, a subject and not wholly an object, an end in himself and not a means to an end, self-determined and not other determined, and so on. But the self appears to be dominantly the opposite in the African worldview. Consequently, the concept of African personality, person and identity as the self ignores the values of personal initiative, responsibility, subjective and independence, which values and clearly cherishes, which is valued and clearly cherished by individuals practically in all cultures. This is seen as a serious attack on the very root of human freedom and autonomy. It is the sense of the self or personhood as an individual in African philosophy is highly problematic and inadequate for that system. From the critiques above, we may extract four possible issues. First, the concern about the seemingly diminished role and values of the individual or individuality. The critics are concerned that the individual is being subjected, swallowed, sacrificed, and might become redundant. The individual, in fact, does not become less important in the African worldview, but he remains active and responsible for the development of the other and himself. Second, there is concern about the core values. The values of the African freedom, such as harmony, interdependence, cooperation, community, are almost the opposite to the values of conventional concept of freedom as independence, individuality, autonomy, and auto-decision. The values of the African freedom are consistent with the African metaphysics or worldview. Third, the concern about the African worldview or the African system of values itself, which the critics think is problematic and inadequate as compared to the conventional system of values. The comparative studies help to clarify different systems and often presents an opportunity for different systems to learn from each other. Fourth, our concern about a universalist tendency to judge the African worldview, which is perceived as inferior, against the conventional worldview, which is perceived as the standard. The African worldview has its strong and weak points and can learn from the conventional worldview. Also, the conventional worldview can also do the same. I will now move on to freedom in the colonial time. The European expansionist policy had its theoretical framework in the modern dualist exclusionist philosophy. Modern philosophy was concerned about building a secure foundation on which to build our knowledge. Both rationalism and empiricism are foundationalist philosophies that attempted to build firm knowledge following the scientific method. Although philosophical dualism was not the aim of the modern project, it was nevertheless one of its byproducts. Colonialism was based on the dualist ontology that imposed being and non-being to the colonized and the colonized, respectively. The emphasis of modernist theory on the power of the human reason, the pursuit of indubitable truth, dualist ontology, and knowledge universalism had strong influence on the colonial expansionism, oppression, and racial discrimination. The domination and exploitation of the colonized, King argued, was justified on the colonizer's negative conception of otherness. Metaphysics of modernity imposed a dualist ontology of knowledge and ignorance, culture and uncultured, white and black, civilized and civilized, light and darkness, human being and non-human being. The African remained in the colonizer's eyes, inauthentic, untrue, invisible, or what Frantz Fanon describes as black skins, white masks. Below, we are going to do a bit of a survey on the views of the scholars on the European expansionist program. Ducor observes that with the emergence of the white man's imperialism in Africa, the existential humanistic culture of the Black continent was misconceived and misinterpreted. He describes the act of colonization as the dismembering of the human race that is accentuated and propagated by racist philosophy. Ducor further observes that racism was viewed not only as a natural, but as bogus, in the sense that it was an invention of one race to assert its authority over others. Slavery marked the introduction of a clear disjunction in the human race. The misconception and misinterpretation of the African beliefs, knowledge, and values was evident in government policies, academic researches, and religious liturgy in that time. Okolo states that the African experience of colonialism was a tragic one, particularly in the assimilation policies of the Portuguese, as well as the French colonial lords. And elsewhere, Okolo observes that the assimilation policy amounted to making French citizens out of Black people. It means the uprootedness of their being and cultural values, since they were neither accepted as French people nor as distinct citizens of the Black world. The policy simply ignores and even despised the whole issues of civilization of the African people. In Mozambique, for instance, the Portuguese colonial states implemented a legislation to divide the population into categories that had different rights and different privileges. A certificate of assimilation was given, which gave the bearer of the certificate an honorary white status. The African elites had to apply for this certificate and had to meet specific criteria. Unlike the rest of the indigenous population, the assimilators, or those who would have assimilated, or those who would have attained the certificate, were exempted from forced labor. They traveled freely and they had better access to education and would get employed in civil service. There is an element that I still need to find evidence about, because there is the talk about Portugal sending their degradados, the so-called the lower end, people, the prisoners and those who cause mischief. They send them to Mozambique to specifically impregnate the Black women and Black girls to improve the skin pigment of the population. I am still struggling to really find the evidence. If there is anyone who, has got something on this, please, help me with that. Chukujeku submits that the time of colonization was seen as a period of total eclipse of the Black man and the full worth of his civilization, complete self-alienation, and as a Black African with a distinct future. The colonial project thrived on the value imposition through knowledge and value displacement, a scenario that Ramos and Tandon best describe as epistemicide, deliberate effort to exterminate the knowledge systems of marginalized people, in our case, the epistemologies of the Black Africans, and replace them by Western knowledge systems. This would make, Tandon makes an important observation that the unilateral imposition of the meaning of experience, knowledge, and truth was a clear violation of what he terms knowledge democracy. The foregoing shows that slavery and colonization operated on the principles of racial discrimination, oppression, social, economic, and political dispossession. During the colonial times, the Black Africans were forced to accept their non-human or non-being status. And for them, the only option to be that was made available to the other was to be white. So to be was to be the other. The colonial government rewarded the African elites and those who despise and renounce their African beliefs, knowledge, and values to assume those of the colonial polity, with an upgrade of status from non-being to some lower form of being, with some privileges to motivate the rest of the indigenous population to envy them and possibly strive to do the same. The motivation to become an African elite or an assimilado in the French or Portuguese colonies was the question for survival. For most Africans, slavery and colonization introduced conflict of identity and value. African identity was put at risk through colonialism. E.B. Du Bois best captures the resultant situation as double consciousness or split personality when he describes the condition of the African American as, open quote, one ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one Black body, who dodged strength along keeps it from torn asunder. Close quote. Paulo Freire clearly describes the internalized duality of the colonized people when he observes that the oppressed are fully aware that without freedom, they cannot exist, and the oppressed desire authentic freedom, yet they fear it. And hence they end up being at once themselves and the oppressor, whose consciousness they have internalized. I will look at freedom in post-colonial Africa. Political independence brought new challenges to the formerly colonized states. The major challenge was how to escape the grindlocks of European civilization. Western colonization is certainly an important event in African history. Although it ended decades ago, colonization created a crisis of identity in Africa. We read to assess that, and I quote, contemporary African experience is marked by a certain intellectual anomaly. The African today, as a rule, lives in cultural flux, characterized by confused interplay between the indigenous cultural heritage and the foreign cultural legacy of a colonial origin. Implicated at the deepest reaches of this cultural amalgam is the superimposition of Western conceptions on the good upon the African thought and conduct. The issues involved here are of utmost existential agency, for it may well be that of instabilities of contemporary African societies are traceable to this circumstance, close quote. Ducor makes an astute observation that the assertion that African philosophy is African freedom.
Blessing, if it's okay, Blessing, if you could sum up reasonably soon, thanks, so we could like to have some time for questions.
All right, thank you. So I will just look a little bit about freedom in the post colonial state. There is the issue of the deep-seated universalism and authoritarianism of the Western philosophy. The double bind recognizes the Western philosophy as proper and African philosophy as something that can be judged against the Western philosophy. I will actually move a little bit and talk a little bit on the freedom in contemporary Africa. With most African countries approaching their golden jubilee of independence celebrations, there is no better time to take the barometer reading and look at the value of freedom in African societies. There is the question which is continuously being asked at the moment: is Africa really free? And the answers that are actually being given is Africa is not really free because of all the problems that Africa is facing at the moment. And if we look at most of the African states at the moment, there seem to be problems. And because of these problems that seem to be very deep-seated in the African states, there is the question of whether Africa is really free. And I think there is actually an opportunity to interrogate the issue of freedom when most of the African countries are reaching their golden jubilees. And I would, at this point, I would actually, invite African thinkers and African philosophers and politicians to try and think seriously about the African situation at the moment, because the African situation is Africans are becoming disillusioned, both in Africa and in the diaspora, and they are not quite sure when Africa will realize freedom in terms of asserting itself as a partner in global civilization. I will actually leave it at that point for now. Thank you.